What are the facts about the most famous Polish alien abduction incident in that country's history? Join me today to learn about the story of the 71-year-old farmer Jan Wolski and his extraordinary experience. There are many potential explanations for his story, in addition to the possibility that it might have actually been an alien abduction. Yet, there's also a crazy conspiracy that might explain what Wolski experienced. After the Gdynia incident in 1959, which I covered in another video, the skies seemed to light up with unexplained phenomena. But one encounter stood out from the rest, the Emilcin Incident. It's one of the rare UFO cases with a memorial, and one I visited during a My Dark Path research trip to Poland late last year. In 1978, 71-year-old farmer Jan Wolski claimed he hadn't just seen a UFO, but had actually voluntarily entered one. And until Wolski died in 1991, no one was able to prove that he was either lying or hallucinating. People who knew him described the elderly man as honest, straightforward, reliable, and straight-talking. Wolski's wild tale might have opened the floodgates of UFO reports from his homeland, and from 78 to 89, as the communist system started to collapse, UFO reports skyrocketed. That's over 400 official sightings, with 1979 being the peak year for extraterrestrial activity. And remember, that's just the reported cases. Who knows how many other encounters went unshared? These weren't just lights in the sky. We're talking about close encounters of the second and third kind. Some mimicked Wolski's experience, while others were even wilder, though sadly many of these stories have faded into obscurity over time. And the Emilcin Incident is one of those few Polish UFO close encounters that has been published outside of the country. Hi, I'm MF Thomas, and this is My Dark Path, where we explore conspiracies, the paranormal, and the unexplained. And so, my friends, let's begin. On Wednesday, May 10, 1978, Wolski woke up at 5 a.m., harnessing a 4-year-old mare to a cart, planning to drive her to the town of Dąbrowa Kumierska. They would visit a local farmer with a stallion that would breed with Wolski's mare. Jan Wolski was born in 1907, and after his elementary education, he started farming, living in the village of Emilcin, a heavily agricultural area with 74 farms and only one shop. Until 1978, Wolski had never traveled far from his home, other than a brief trip to the Ukraine before World War II, a distance of about 200 miles. After completing their task in the town, Wolski and the mare started their way home. The hour was still early, about 7:20 a.m. They had taken the trip along dirt roads, for he had not had the time to get the mare shod and didn't want to make her walk on a paved road. Today, this is the Lublin Highway, and his extraterrestrial encounter started at this moment. As Wolski and the mare traveled along the dirt road beneath the trees, they approached a meadow. It was the first time the mare had walked along most of this route, and at this moment, Wolski observed two persons walking in the same direction as he was going, over the right-hand side of the meadow, and at this time, they were about 120 feet away from him. At first, Wolski thought they were hunters, and as the cart entered the meadow, he noted that these figures were walking in a way that made him think that they were waiting for Wolski to get near them. And as he watched the figures, Wolski started to think that they weren't hunters. As he drew closer, he thought the figures had an unusual greenish tinge to their faces. And he also noted something odd about their movement. Their walking reminded him of a film he'd seen about scuba divers and how they moved when walking on the ocean floor. The figures would rise with each footstep before slowly settling back down. And Wolski described the situation like this.
When they heard my horse and cart rumbling along, the figures began to turn and look back toward me. And when I got closer, I saw their faces, which appeared green in color. I was surprised, but I continued to drive the cart. There is a small stream there, though at the time it was no more than a muddy pool. They tried to jump over the stream, but one of them landed in it.
As he drew up to the two figures, they each stepped aside, one to the right and one to the left of his cart, to let him through. And now he heard their voices, and of this Wolski said,
They were not speaking to me, but rather to each other, and their language was very bizarre. I don't know how they could understand one another. When we talk, we do it slower, but if we were to talk in that manner, we would never be understood.
One report stated that the mare struggled to pull the cart with the added weight. Today, any one of us would be fearful if someone tried to get into our car, but Wolski said that he wasn't initially afraid of the beings, and it was the first time he was able to observe them up close. The aliens were about 5.5 feet tall. As he'd seen earlier, they were slim and dressed in elastic one-piece suits of a grayish-black hue that resembled rubber. This suit covered the entire body except for the face and the hands, and at the lower end it included the feet. The suit adhered closely to their bodies except in the waist region, which was less close-fitting. And their suits didn't have buttons, pockets, or a belt, and the ends of the sleeves fitted closely around their wrists. Their heads were large, and their faces were in fact green and sported high cheekbones. Their eyes were almond-shaped and very long. Their eyes were also wholly dark and did not have what we would call a white of the eye. And in place of the nose, there was only a slight bulge with two small vertical openings. Their mouths were straight and thin. Later, Wolski noted that the figures grimaced periodically, which he found unpleasant. The movement of their mouths, though, could have just been smiles, and sometimes their mouths would twist to one side. They had no lips, and their teeth were white, and no hair was visible on their faces. Their hands, green, were slim. They had 5 fingers, and a membrane caused each finger to be webbed. The membrane was green and elastic, connecting each contiguous 2 fingers except for the space between the thumb and the index finger, and it began at the level of the first joint of each finger. Wolski did not see that they had fingernails. And at their shoulders, the beings had a hump, as though a rolled-up blanket had been slipped under their one-piece suits. Wolski could not see if this was due to their anatomy or was a part of their suit. And lastly, their legs were long and seemed thicker than the legs of a man. Their footwear and the legs of the trousers were fully integrated. And when the creatures now were sitting in the cart with their legs hanging down, their legs were curved in such a semicircular fashion that they looked like prehensile limbs. And so, surprised but not fearful, Wolski drove the cart another 100 feet or so until they entered a clearing. And at this moment, one of the aliens signaled to him to stop. In the clearing, what was in front of him shook Wolski. A large, white object hung in the air about 50 feet above the ground, framed by a row of trees. My novel, Arcade, is more than just a sci-fi thriller. It's an exploration of what happens when the technology that we depend on suddenly disappears. Fans of Ready Player One, Alien, and Interstellar will find familiar elements here. A collapsed society, mysterious alien forces, and a fight for survival against overwhelming odds. But at its core, Arcade is about the unbreakable bonds of family and the lengths we'll go to protect those we love. Kirkus Reviews called Arcade a confident sci-fi thriller that deftly addresses themes of resilience, faith, and the value of video games. Perhaps the wise farmer who'd seen his share of wonders over his 7 decades could have shrugged off the presence of these two odd beings, but this hovering craft cemented in his mind that he was experiencing something extraordinary. In his own words, Wolski said,
I drove the cart to the bushes, and as we passed them, I noticed a bus in the air. I was extremely surprised. I said to myself, what's going on? It was easily visible. and was entirely white like a crystal. The road led me towards the craft, so I tried to speed up and avoid it. At around 60 feet in front of the craft, one of the beings gestured me to stop. I wasn't afraid. I stopped the horse, but it's an animal with such a character that it won't stop unless it wants to. So the being grasped the reins of the cart and helped me stop it. Not surprisingly, the horse then became a bit uneasy.
At this moment, it's worth understanding Wolski in more detail. Rather than judge him by the standards of the 2020s, consider that he had only finished 3 grades at elementary school, supplemented by education at a village school, and had some private home tutoring. And he lived the lifestyle typical of any Polish farmer at the time. He and his family did not even have a TV or a radio. Farm duties filled his day with occasional holidays and visits to the local Catholic church. And I share this not to deride his simplicity, but to remind us of how blessed we are with a life of relative ease and convenience, and recall that the virtues of hard work and patience are, sadly, all too rare in the modern world. And so anyone who tells you, posturing on social media, how difficult their life is today, likely wouldn't have survived a week working alongside Wolski. It's always good to stay humble, my friends. When Wolski entered the clearing, the farmer heard a faint humming sound emitted by the object in the air. At first, the mare did not want to stop, and one of the beings leapt forward and seized the reins, pulling on them to bring her to a halt. And here the figures jumped from the cart, motioning for Wolski to follow. One of them even helped him get down. Wolski found their skin was soft to the touch, yet quite cold. Wolski also remembered being surprised by the strength that the small being possessed in its wrists. The object was approximately 15 feet long, 9 feet wide, and about 8 feet tall. Wolski likened it to a short bus with a barn-like roof. It had no windows. The object's surface was pristine, free of seams, rivets, or welds. It appeared to him as if it had been cast from a flawless piece of material, and it also gleamed as if nickel-plated. It hovered against a backdrop of tall birch trees, remaining stationary just below their peaks, which ranged between 20 to 30 feet high. Even though the craft was glowing in a transparent white color, it did not cast shadows against the trees behind it. And at each corner of the object, about halfway up, there were 4 barrels with black rods running through them. These rods spun rapidly, and their motion produced a faint but constant hum that Wolski first heard from about 90 feet away. As he approached, the hum grew louder, resembling the buzzing of bees in flight. The barrels emitted spirals of color, giving the object an ethereal quality, but curiously, the fast-spinning rods did not appear to stir the air. The craft hovered gently, rising and falling about a foot or so as it did. Lastly, a lift platform hovered a few feet off the ground, held by 4 thin, transparent cables, which also shimmered with a pearly, nickel-like effect. After being helped off his cart, Wolski followed the 2 beings toward the object. When they arrived nearly beneath it, the lift, held by the 4 cables, lowered itself noiselessly to the ground. One of the beings stepped into the lift and indicated that Wolski should do the same, showing him that he should also grab the cables. The other being did not board the lift, but returned to the horse. The lift rose rapidly into the air, stopping before the opening in the craft. Wolski felt nothing as it rose, and it was unclear what made it work. The being who was accompanying him signaled for him to enter. Reportedly, Wolski felt some unknown mental prompting that helped him decide to go inside. But before doing so, he stopped before the craft door and turned around. From the air, he saw the other being who had remained in the clearing. It was now studying his horse. Before stepping through the opening, Wolski paused and braced himself with his right hand against the entrance. It was square, but with rounded corners, and was about 6 feet high. At the point where it connected with the wall of the craft, the wall and the door had no visible seam or connection. The door appeared to just roll up inside the craft toward the right-hand side. As he stepped in, Wolski's right hand gripped the opening, and he recalled that the walls were at least 1.5 inches thick, but might have even been thicker. Now inside, he was greeted by two more beings indistinguishable from the first two on the ground. One of them was eating something that looked like an icicle. The being broke the food apart like a biscuit and offered some to Wolski. He declined as he gazed at his surroundings. The chamber was rectangular. There was no internal lighting other than the daylight from the open door. The walls, floor, and ceiling were a grayish black. The floor, though, shined as though it were polished. The walls were smooth and hard to the touch and made of a material resembling glass. Seats were fastened against each wall, attached by two black cables. Reports differ about the number of seats in the cabin, but there were undoubtedly more seats than the 4 aliens Wolski had observed. Wolski did not know whether this chamber was the only one in the craft or whether there were other beings there. The height of the ceiling from the floor was about 6 feet high. 2 black tubes ran from one wall to the other. Later analysis of Wolski's story emphasizes that there must have been something above the ceiling, as the external height of the craft was about 9 feet, and Wolski wondered later what might have been up in the loft. Aboard the ship, the humming noise that Wolski had heard outside was far less perceptible, and the creatures made no sound as they walked about on the cabin floor. Now acclimated, Wolski turned back to the aliens. The one who had come in with Wolski indicated to him to undress. Wolski took off his coat, his jacket, and his shirt. The intruders were in a hurry, for one of them helped Wolski to unbutton his shirt. The being, observing his mare, came into the cabin several minutes later, arriving while he was undressing. Wolski stopped after removing his outer clothing, then one told him to undress completely, and he started to comply. And while he did so, an expression appeared on the faces of these aliens, containing at the same time something that Wolski felt was both a smile and a grimace. With Wolski now completely naked, one of the beings produced 2 disc-shaped objects, holding one in each hand. It seemed to Wolski that they were attached to his palms by something like a suction pad. These gray discs vibrated, emitting a dull humming sound with no metallic tone. And the being who had brought Wolski up the lift started positioning him in front of the being holding the discs. First, he presented one side, and then with his back toward him, and then finally the other side, followed by his front. And when Wolski presented a side, he had to raise the corresponding arm. And later, Wolski said that this made him think that the aliens were photographing him from the front, back, and sides. Some reports state that the alien with the discs moved around Wolski rather than having him turn. But either way, during this activity, Wolski suddenly became aware that the aliens gave off a powerful smell, something like burning sulfur. The smell was so strong that even 2 days later, his coat still smelled strongly of the odor. While undressed, the aliens looked at his clothes spread out on the floor around him. They were particularly interested in his leather trouser belt, alternately unbuckling and buckling it, talking together as they did so. And unlike the physical probing, which for better or worse have become almost a joke in alien abduction stories, the only physical exam the aliens performed was a superficial view one took inside of Wolski's mouth. And with his oral exam complete, his chaperoning alien indicated that he could now put his clothes on again. Inside the alien craft, Wolski felt the temperature was somewhat warmer than it was outside. Wolski also recalled 2 other significant events from his time inside the craft. First, one alien who had not been participating in his examination had been walking up and down in the chamber, occasionally putting a small black rod into 2 holes in one of the walls. The length of the rod has been reported differently, everything from about the size of a pen up to about a foot in length, but all reports state that it had a little black knob at one end. Periodically, the alien would put the rod into a hole in the wall, then turned it like a key in a lock before moving it to another hole and repeating the action. The purpose of this was not clear to Wolski. The second observation he made was that part of the ship's floor was covered with black birds. He thought he saw 10 in total, thinking they were either crows or rooks. They appeared to be alive, their heads and eyes moving, but otherwise they seemed paralyzed. While in the cabin, the beings paid no attention to these captive birds. And I'll make an aside here. I've read dozens of accounts of Wolski's story, and until this moment, I've always assumed that the aliens caught the birds deliberately for examination or perhaps inadvertently stunned them by the power of the alien craft. But what if, like the meme of birds aren't real, these birds were not real birds, but alien drones ready to be released into the area? Wolski observed that they were not dead and only their heads and eyes were active. Perhaps they were simply in a low power mode before being activated for their surveillance mission. When Wolski was dressed again, the aliens showed him the way out. Then, perhaps unexpectedly, he doffed his cap and bowed, saying goodbye. Likewise, the aliens smiled or grimaced. The same lift took Wolski down, but not all the way to the ground, but nearly to it. He had to jump, and when he braced himself against the platform to jump, it seemed to him that it neither moved nor shook. Wolski returned to his horse and cart. Arriving there, he found that the mare had been grazing and had eaten quite a lot of grass while waiting. He sat down in his cart and looked at the UFO where he'd just spent the most unusual moments of his life. Standing in the entrance of the object, he saw 2 or 3 of the entities watching him. His horse, now seemingly anxious to depart, galloped along the dirt track back toward home. And in about 10 minutes, they arrived back at his farm. Wolski unhitched and cared for the mare before entering his home. No one was there except his wife. His sons would arrive a little later. When he told his family of his experience, they ran to find some neighbors, and then they went to the clearing. Later reports said that Mrs. Wolski noted that her husband had fallen asleep for several hours upon returning home before telling his story. Later, Wolski was noted to have been experiencing symptoms of shock at this time. When Wolski's sons and neighbors arrived at the clearing, they found it empty. But searching the site, they discovered traces that something had been there. They found imprints of strange footwear at 3 places, twice in the meadow, and one set near a curtain of trees that had masked the meadow from the road. 6 people, including 2 members of the Wolski family, verified the presence of these footprints. The footprints were trapezoidal, almost rectangular in shape. The underneath part of the sole was convex, and the 2 long sides of the footprint went down into the soil to a depth of an inch or so. Each print was slightly longer than the average human footprint. His sons and neighbors also found corn stalks that had been uprooted and holes in the ground that gave the impression that samples had been dug from it. And lastly, they found one bizarre artifact, a group of black feathers, all of precisely the same length. Finally, the ad hoc group inspected the area where Wolski's horse had grazed. While Wolski himself thought he'd only been inside the craft for about 12 minutes, different analysts argue that the amount of grass consumed indicate that the horse could have been grazing for up to 2 hours. But other than these observations, there were no other pieces of evidence of the aliens or UFO. But the event, even in the tightly controlled communist state of Poland at this time, would not remain a secret for long. As I mentioned, Poland had experienced a spate of hundreds of UFO sightings in the 1970s, and these had led to the rise of many ufologists. And so, about 2 weeks after the event, Witold Wajanek, who lived in nearby Lublin, was the first ufologist to speak with Jan Wolski. He arrived at the farm around May 26, 1978. Then Dr. Biganu Blania Bolnar of Lodz also arrived in Emilcin, where he and his team started to investigate the event and conducted several tests and examinations of Wolski's mental and physical condition. Their findings all pointed to one thing, that Wolski was in excellent physical and mental shape, given his age, and that he was very objective in how he saw the world. He was not delusional. Blania's researchers also found that he was not suggestible and did not have a tendency toward lying. The medical test showed that Wolski's sight and hearing was good and that his reflexes were normal. According to a psychologist in Dr. Blania Bolnar's investigation group, Wolski was telling the truth, or at least Wolski believed he was telling the truth as he understood it. With this established, some of Blania Bolnar's team started to ask, was Wolski the only person who saw the UFO and the aliens? There were other witnesses in the area. At approximately 8 a.m. on the morning of Wolski's experience, an unusual event unfolded in another part of Emilcin, on a farm about 3/4 of a mile from his encounter. Adis and Agenska Papitek, siblings aged 6 and 4, were playing in their backyard when they observed something extraordinary passing overhead. Their mother, Jania, was preparing breakfast inside the house when an unusual and loud noise caught her attention. When interviewed later, she noted the explosion, quote, "You could have said that it came from the ground," end quote. Concerned for her children's safety, she checked on them but found them safe and playing quietly in the yard. She returned to her task, but young Addis came to her moments later with a startling story. He told his mother that an aircraft resembling a bus had just flown over their farm at about the height of their barn. He said the aircraft had only one window and Addis had seen the pilot through it. According to the researchers who interviewed the family, Addis could not have invented this story based on rumors of Wolski's encounter, and his sister was too small to have been interviewed. Their reports, in Blania Bolnar's opinion, described the same craft from Wolski's experience. Addis, for example, told them that the pilot's outfit was dark gray and that he had a green face. Although Wolski's account seemed to be sincere as the story leaked, many assumed that he'd been tricked or had dreamt of the alien encounter. The press proposed several theories. The first hypothesis was that he had been involved in a deliberate prank. The second was that Wolski had misidentified a helicopter, and the third hypothesis was that Wolski had had vivid alcoholic hallucinations. And the fourth theory, although it was not promoted by the press, was that Wolski's experience had been real. The researcher Blania Bolnar stayed in the area, observing Wolski and conducting interviews with members of the local community who knew him. And as a result, he was convinced that Wolski would not have misidentified a helicopter and that he was not an alcoholic. He determined that there were no helicopter flights in the area on the day of the event in May. But Wolski, despite the support of his story from Blania Bolnar, became frustrated with the constant reporting and questioning of his experience. He said,
"You should know that I came to the conclusion that I should have kept my mouth shut about it. But my neighbors spread the rumors, then that went nationwide."
Despite his reluctance, Wolski spoke at the 5th Polish UFO conference years later. Unfortunately, I can't find any direct transcript of his remarks at that meeting. Instead, this script is based on reports of people who attended it. However, reports about him validated that he was a stalwart community member. Other investigators who came later found him solid, sincere, and honest, fully worthy of confidence. The interviews of his neighbors in Emilcin noted that he had never been seen drunk, he did not smoke, and he had no bad habits. His upbringing and continued faith in the Catholic Church also reinforced for some investigators that Wolski saw God as his witness to the veracity of his statements. And this leads us to a fascinating conspiratorial angle on this story. But before I share this, I'll offer one more hypothesis about what Wolski saw and experienced. If we accept for a moment the idea that the aliens and the UFO were real, what explains the need for the simple yet unsophisticated exam of Wolski? Why would aliens capable of interstellar travel do something as rudimentary as this exam of this subject? Here's my hypothesis. Could these aliens have simply been autonomous robots and their exam of Wolski a boot-up routine designed to calibrate their sensing capabilities? Now, a second hypothesis, again accepting for a moment that the experience was genuinely extraterrestrial, would be this. While the anatomy of amphibians like frogs is extraordinarily well understood and documented, how many middle school students will still learn about their anatomy by physically dissecting a frog during a biology class? Didactic experience is a critical part of the learning process. Therefore, if aliens were visiting Earth, could their hands-on experiences require each of them to have personal experience with the human race that inhabits Earth? Again, these are arguments that might be used to explain why Wolski's experience could be reasonable if it were indeed a close encounter of the third kind. Of course, all evidence showed that he was not a drunk or a liar, and the debate about the truth of Wolski will likely never be answered satisfactorily. Yet, there may be another terrestrial explanation for his experience involving an extraordinary conspiracy. The UFO reacher Blania Bolnar was a mysterious and rather unpopular person and ufologist. His fellow Polish ufologists thought him to be arrogant, and some even called him an agent of the communist Polish government. Given what we know about the FBI's involvement in infiltrating public UFO societies in the US, this is perhaps a very reasonable hypothesis. Still, Blania Bolnar's connection with the communist state security apparatus remains very unclear. Many researchers may have just been jealous and attempted to defame him with the equivalent of calling someone a Nazi or racist in today's society. But either way, Blania Bolnar did not allow these slights to go without a response. He frequently refuted these claims, even calling one researcher publicly an ape. His role in promoting the Emilcin story would be brought back into the forefront in 2013 when a researcher, Bartosz Radowski, published a book titled, when translated to English, Secret Operations of the Polish People's Republic and UFOs. With the tenacity of a detective, Bartosz had acquired Blania Bolnar's archives after his death. As he pored over the yellowed documents and faded photographs, a different narrative began to emerge that might explain the whole Wolski abduction. Bartosz's hypothesis sounds almost like a Shakespearean tale of two ufologists, Blania Bolnar and his rival Witold Jovanik, the two researchers who had first brought Wolski's claims to light. Bartosz claimed that, about a month before the Wolski encounter, the two ufologists had made a bet. Blania Bolnar would have someone hypnotize Jovanik to remember something that had never actually happened. Jovanik thought this was ludicrous, but eventually they arranged a time and a place to settle the bet, and hypnotist Lech Stefanski managed to put Jovanik in a trance-like state, and the ufologist woke up with some demonstrably false memories. Of course, Jovanik felt humiliated and decided to get revenge on his rival. Jovanik planned his revenge using Jan Wolski, a simple farmer who lived in nearby Emilcin. The plan was simple: implant an unbelievable story of an alien encounter, let Blania Bolnar run with it, and then reveal the truth, humiliating his rival once and for all. How this plan was to be implemented is unknown. I don't know how a man could kidnap someone, erase those memories, and then implant some selective memories about an alien abduction, but still the account from Bartosz is worth considering. But fate, if this actually occurred, had a sense of humor. Blania Bolnar, when presented with this extraordinary tale, didn't just run with it, he sprinted. His passionate promotion of the Emilcin Incident as a genuine close encounter caught fire in the Polish and international UFO community, and before Jovanik could even unveil his grand deception, the story had taken a life of its own, growing beyond any possibility of a debunking. As Bartosz pieced together this puzzle, he faced more questions than answers. He did find that Blania Bolnar had manipulated the children's testimony of the UFO flying over their house, but in the end, despite his exhaustive research, he was forced to conclude that the truth of what happened in Emilcin is likely never to be known. And as we reach the end of this story, the Emilcin Incident, whether it was a genuine brush with extraterrestrials or an elaborate hoax or something in between, is a testament to the power of belief and the complexity of human nature. It serves as a reminder that in the search for extraterrestrial truth, we must never underestimate the terrestrial capacity for deception, even self-deception. And so, as the sun sets over Emilcin's fields today, the mystery lingers, a whisper in the wind. Then somewhere, perhaps, Jan Wolski's otherworldly visitors watch and wonder at the curious ways of earthly beings. And maybe, just maybe, those alien drone crows are still watching us today, sending their findings back to aliens on another world. Thank you for joining me in this episode of My Dark Path. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you didn't enjoy it, I'm so grateful you made it this far. Thank you, dear friends, for walking the dark paths of the world with me. Until next time, good night.